The New York Times editorial board is doing something a little different this year when it comes to their presidential endorsement. They're doing interviews of the presidential candidates and they're putting clips out on social media in order to let the public know what their process is a little like. Now, in a series of tweets, they wrote, "The Times editorial board has endorsed presidential candidates for decades, but never like this. All of our endorsement interviews with the Democratic candidates were conducted on the record, and we're releasing the full transcript of each interview. These interviews have historically happened behind closed doors. This year, we hope openness from the Times' editorial board will give readers a new understanding of the issues facing the nation." Now, included in that tweet was a short clip featuring Bernie Sanders, and I wouldn't really care too much about what they're doing if it weren't for the clip that they released, because they asked him a really important question. And I think this is the first time he managed to connect the economic frustrations that Americans feel today to the racial issues that the country's facing. Take a look.
About the fact that Trump has touched a chord in 40 to 44% of the people. What about that issue? It's like Trump is a symptom of a widespread problem.
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you address that?
What is the issue? How did Trump become president? Not everybody, but tens and tens of millions of Americans feel that the political establishment, Republican and Democrat, have failed them. Maybe the New York Times has failed them too.
That explains the appeal of racism?
Yeah, people are in many cases in this country working longer hours for low wages. You are aware of the fact that in an unprecedented way, life expectancy is actually going down in America because of diseases of despair. People have lost hope and they are drinking, they're doing drugs, they're committing suicide. And when that condition arises, whether it was the 1930s in Germany, then people are susceptible to the blame game, to say that it is the undocumented people in this country who are the cause of all of our problems. And if we just throw 10 million people out of the country, you're gonna have a good job, and you're gonna have good health care, and you have good education. That's all we gotta do. So all over the world, Trump didn't invent demagoguery. It's an age-old weapon, and you take a minority and you demonize that minority and you blame that minority, and you take the despair and the anger and the frustration that people are feeling, and you say that's the cause of your problem.
So I really appreciated that clip. I thought that that was a great clip. Just the mere fact that he specifically said maybe the New York Times has failed them too makes me pretty confident in saying that they're unlikely to endorse him. Even if he hadn't said that, I don't think they would have endorsed him anyway, but it doesn't matter. I think that they're doing a public service and releasing clips like this and being a little more transparent with their process. I wanted to get your take. What did you think of that?
I mean, I think a lot of things. I think it's a great entertainment product. And I think that if anything, this past year has reminded us that news is so often entertainment. I think they know what they're doing and that they hope to gain subscribers, and they're a business. I think that their business, my personal belief is that their business and the way they run their business has to be somewhat toxified by their proximity to Wall Street. And I think Bernie Sanders said the most important political thought of our era, in my personal opinion, which is that the wealth gap, and by proxy, the racial wealth gap and gender wealth gap and all these other things, is the tip of the spear for all other ills across our society. Now, he believes that deeply, and that is such a clear belief that he encapsulates so well. For me, that moment's thrilling. I got the chills.
Yeah, I got emotional watching that because he has this way of talking about the issues that keep a lot of Americans up at night, the stuff that gives us anxiety. It's usually these worries about how we're gonna afford our medical bills, how we're gonna pay for our children's education, how are we gonna afford housing, how are we gonna put food on the table, right? And it's so rare to see a politician who connects with you on such an important level, right? And who can really speak to the issues you face. Because when you really look at the vast majority of politicians in America, they're not grappling with the same issues. Many of them are millionaires themselves. I mean, you look at the insane amount of wealth, just random politician that came to mind right now, the insane amount of wealth someone like Senator Dianne Feinstein has, right? And you're like, well, does Feinstein really understand where I'm coming from or the kind of life that I'm living or the types of anxieties that I have? So that's the reason why I got emotional watching that, because it's like, oh my God, there's someone who actually like really understands. But I wanted to get your thoughts on this too, Dan, because I think a lot of people have difficulty connecting economic frustrations to racial tensions. And I'm curious if you think that Bernie did a good job answering that question.
Yeah, and of course, Bernie's been on the microscope a little bit for his like connecting racial policies to economic policies, because to some who aren't familiar with the way Bernie rolls, that can seem like, oh, you're missing the argument, you're trying to talk around it. But what I think he did there, which is really important, is have a good diagnosis of the problem from like a macro scale. He's saying that the, like what you were talking about, Steve, the issues that individual people have, the struggles that they face with paying bills, their healthcare issues, that makes them angry and that makes them vengeful. And when they feel like they can't do anything about that, they look to their leaders to say, okay, what are you doing? And when their leaders don't have any solutions or aren't interested in doing that, they do things like say, oh, blame the poor people, blame the brown people, that kind of thing. And so that's, people kind of raised their eyes in that New York Times opinion interview because they were kind of shocked at that. But that's actually saying, no, Trump won because he took issues that people are facing, black, brown, white, and weaponize them against immigrants, against people of color as a political tool. And he's willing to do that again with war, he's willing to do that again with race or the economy. It's just one of his tactics. And the fact that Bernie can diagnose that and call that out, to me, doesn't necessarily bring me to tears, but like it's a kind of confidence that I don't experience with a lot of politicians.
Right. And one other economist who does a good job in explaining the connection is Richard Wolff. So check out his work, and it'll kind of like fill in the blanks and give you more detail into how even historically this tactic has been used, this divide and conquer tactic has been used by bad actors in politics. But I also, go ahead.
Let's say you were a candidate, right? And you said, okay, we're gonna treat racism, we're gonna treat this end product. We're gonna treat the pimple and not clean the skin, or whatever it is of racism. We're gonna play the end game here. And you were also heavily invested in venture capital or banking funds, tranches in the real estate market or whatever it was. Couldn't you make the argument, and this is radical, but couldn't you make the argument that someone who is invested in the stock market in our modern form of corporatism is just because we know that captures wealth from the system and that level of wealth capture inherently increases the racial wealth gap, that is almost racist.
Right.
And so for a candidate to just play that end game and go like, oh, I'm gonna treat racism just as this end product, Bernie is saying, we know where some of that comes from. I'm not saying that that's where racial beliefs come from, but it is damn sure easier to radicalize people who have been, who are in this place where they feel financially disempowered.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I also wanted to talk a little bit more about what he mentioned in that video about life expectancy, because that's a huge story that's gotten a little bit of coverage, but no one's really looked into why life expectancy has been declining in America. So that means the average number of years a person can expect to live in any given country. And so I looked into some of the latest studies on this. There was a great article written on CNN's online platform, and they talk about this study in November of 2019. And life expectancy at birth continues to drop for Americans, a new study finds. Drug overdoses, suicides, alcohol-related illnesses, and obesity are largely to blame. These problems have been building since the 1980s. I think it's important to look at the timeline here, right? So what happened in the 1980s? You have the Reagan administration basically cutting taxes, deregulating industry, all of that. And so let's give you more. After 2010, US life expectancy plateaued, and in 2014, it began reversing, dropping for 3 consecutive years from 78.9 years in 2014 to 78.6 years in 2017. This is despite the US spending the most on healthcare per capita than any other country in the world. So when people tell you, like, no, America's the greatest country, right? Like, we have the best healthcare system. We all know that that's not true. There are lessons that we can learn from other countries that are doing things right. Industrialized countries that have honestly beaten us when it comes to education, when it comes to healthcare. Of the Of all age groups, according to this study, adults 25 to 64 years old saw the largest increase in mortality rates at 6%. And I want to read this quote from Dr. Howard Koh. He's a professor who wrote an editorial to go along with this study. He writes, it is a whole constellation of conditions that have shown the impacts of life expectancy. It is not just medical conditions, but also the social drivers that appear to be at play, like income inequality and mental distress. So these are important issues to keep in mind when people are telling you that, no, this system is working fine, everything is great. Those who complain about it just want handouts. Those who complain about it just aren't working hard enough. That's not true. Americans are working harder than they've ever worked before, and they're getting a lot less in return.
And like the point in that last quote that I thought was the main thing was that he said that income inequality and mental distress play a role in the negative health outcomes we're having in our system. So we're paying more to get less coverage all around. We have a society and a social structure where people aren't getting education at the right times. Wealth is unequally distributed and it's hard to get, which exacerbates these problems.
Right.
So we have worse to deal with. So when people say, yes, economics and race and politics and all these social things are connected, it's because in a complicated world, they are.
Yep, exactly. Well, we do have a poll on this and we wanted you guys to jump in and share what you think. So the poll question is, do you believe the New York Times will endorse Bernie Sanders? You could either answer yes or no. We are already, well, at least I shared what my perspective on that is, but we're curious to hear from you. Just go to tyt.com/New York Times, tyt.com/New York Times, and share your answer with us.
TYT is all about challenging and disrupting the status quo, and so is aspiration. Aspiration does not invest your money into fossil fuel businesses that harm our planet, such as pipelines and oil drilling. Instead, you'll be able to fight climate change with tools like AIM, the Aspiration Impact Measurement, and Planet Protection. They also don't hit you with outrageous fees for you to access your own money. You can even earn cash back and get free ATM uses up to 5 times a month. Head to aspiration.com/TYT to learn more. For a limited time, get 30 days of free TYT membership when you sign up.